Hello everyone, I wanted to share a little review on a project I worked on a couple of years ago. It's basically a 1930s, 1920s inspired retro ray gun. Basically, after seeing the Weta ray guns, which were released a few years ago, I decided to try my hand at building my own from scratch. So, well, not entirely from scratch. I had to use found parts. I don't have a CNC machine, so I had to resort to found parts. But one of the first things I did in creating this ray gun was to go out looking for the body, the main body, and the flash hider. So I went to a local junk shop where I came across an andiron, which looks very similar to this. As you can see here, this basic shape is very common in brass sculptures and brass objects, vintage brass objects. If you can't find an andiron, you want to build your own, there are also a lot of lamps which have this particular shape, so you can use that. I know Target has one right now. It's a black lamp that has this very same shape. So that's basically what I use for the body. I also found a candle holder, and the mouth of the candle holder is very similar to the one I used as the flash hider for my ray gun. So you can use a candle holder as a flash hider as well, which is basically what I did. I cut this off and I used it as a flash hider. Now, one of the things that I did after I got these two parts is I needed to design the gun around the shapes of the parts that I had found. So this is a basic illustration I came up with as a design template for the gun. It just makes it easier for me to work with if I have a visual to see what the finished product might look like. So this is a basic idea of what the gun would look like. Once I started building the gun, or once I started on the process, I noticed that the body of the gun, the section right here, just wasn't long enough with the parts that I had found. So I decided to take the andiron and cut it in half. As you can see, here's half of the andiron section and the other half here. And then I decided to add a spacer in between just to give it a little bit more length. So I basically use PVC piping. I cut a small section lengthwise out of it and then squeezed it together and then wrapped a brass plating around it. I then took the brass plating and screwed it onto the actual PVC piping. Once this was done, I was able to slide this section on the top and this section on the bottom. And once that was slid into place, I actually was able to extend the length of the body. As you can see here, here's a spacer and here are the two parts of the andiron. Now the top section over here, the little parts that I added, actually let's start with the rivets. The rivets are basically styrene rods. I drilled holes into the andiron and then just slid the rods in and held them in place with some epoxy. After they were slid in place, I just sanded the top of them off to give them that slightly dome shape which rivets have. I also added a knurled thumb screw, which I found at a hardware store, which is basically this right here. And as you can see, there's also a little spacer underneath, which is part of a grommet, and underneath that, this little washer, which I custom created for this. The grommet was just basically cut out of a brass plating, and I drill holes in it just to give it a little bit of a industrial element there. The pressure gauge was actually created from a small ladies watch which I found at Walmart. You can find them at Kmart, Walmart, any cheap store. I think it only cost me about $5 or $6. But I removed the lugs on the end with a Dremel, filed it down just to smooth it out. Then I took the watch apart and removed the face and created a different face in Photoshop, something that's more more familiar or more similar to something you'd find on a pressure gauge. So I added that face on there and then put the arm back on, put the watch back together, and then screwed it onto the body of the ray gun. The antenna was created by using steel wiring, which I wrapped around a thin rod. Once that coil effect was done by wrapping it around, I just slid the rod out and it left this shape. So another classic 1930s style design right there. The little ball on top is just a little steel bead that I got from an arts and crafts store. The cooling unit is just basically an acrylic test tube. You can find these online. You can buy a whole bunch of them for real cheap, a dozen for a couple of bucks or so. So they're not really that hard to find. On the opposite side, we also have a fuel container, which I basically use a CO2 cartridge, which I took the paint off and then added some aluminum black to give it some weathering. The coil right here is just basically a copper coil, which I wrapped around a rod to give it that coiled effect, and then just inserted into the back of the CO2 cartridge and into this little thumb screw that I found at the hardware store right here. Let's see. Another screw over here. Another little spacer that I found at a hardware store, and a thumb screw on the bottom here. These are basically just attached to a little stem that's attached to the PVC pipe in here. Once I had this done, I decided to add the spacers to the washers, which actually creates a heat sink, which is a pretty classic characteristic of the old 1930s ray guns. So I basically added a spacer. You can find these little spacers in the lamp section of a hardware store, the little spacers that you screw on. By the way, inside the body of the ray gun is a threaded rod, which looks very similar to this. As you can see here, it's a threaded rod which you can screw parts onto. So that runs along the entire body of the gun. It runs inside here and it comes out in the back here. On the back here is a little finial, also found in the lamp parts at the hardware store, and I just screwed that on, which left me with the threaded rod sticking out here, which I was able to screw on these little spacers and slide the washers on. Once that part was finished, I decided to cover up the threaded rod with a little section of brass tubing, which I slid over the threaded rod and added onto here. This is yet another little spacer, also can found in lamp parts at the hardware store. And on the end we have the flash hider, which is the top of the candle holder. I basically cut this off with a Dremel, filed it down, then just slid it right on top. And the end is held in place by another finial right here. It looks very similar to this one. And I just screwed it on. So basically this entire center section is held in place by all these parts being screwed onto a threaded rod, which runs along the middle. The handle of the gun was actually created out of wood. I made a little template on paper, traced it onto a piece of wood, and then I had someone cut it out for me. I didn't have access to the right wood, so I had someone do me a favor, and they actually found the wood for me and did the cutting. So they basically cut the basic shape, and they gave it to me. But once I had the basic shape, I filed and sanded it down and took care of any small, any small markings that might have been left from the cutting process. On either side of the handle, there's a brass plate. There's one on this side and one on this side. These were attached by using these screws just to give it a sort of handle. Typical guns have plates on either side, so I wanted to give it that effect, so I added those on. On the back I added a little plate just to give it that industrial design. These are added on with little brass pins, which I nailed into the wood. The handle was actually attached to the body by using screws. There's one screw right here and there's one hidden underneath the trigger, and they both go up into the body of the actual gun. What else? Let's see. The bottom, the saddle ring. This is just basically another little ball spacer, a ball finial that I found in the lamp parts section at the hardware store. I took a threaded stem from a screw, inserted into the wood, and then I just basically screwed the ball on. The base of the ball on the bottom here is just basically a part of a grommet. Once the ball was secure, I drilled a hole into the ball, and then I took a brass thin rod and curved it, made it into a circle, and then attached it on with a pair of pliers. So basically that's the saddle ring right there. The trigger guard, just a piece of flat iron, actually not iron, it's actually aluminum. I just bent it into shape and then attached it on with these two screws right here. Once that was done, the gun was basically finished. I then had to paint it. I decided to go with a kind of bronzish, worn out metal look, so I kind of painted, gave it a brown hue. Didn't want to keep it brass, but decided to give it a worn industrial look just for the sake of weathering. After it was done, I went ahead and used some acrylic, added some rust stains along the edges or around the actual rivets and screws and stuff, and at the base of the antennas and the joints. I also added some green for verdigris in certain areas. So basically that's about it. So thanks for looking.